City of Fond du Lac Police Department and Drug-Free Communities of Fond du Lac County partnering to host a town hall meeting tonight at the Goodrich Little Theater, beginning a prevention and awareness campaign for Fond du Lac regarding the drug methamphetamine. Dr. Nathan Larson is an emergency room physician with Agnesian Healthcare. Dr. Larson, State Attorney General Brad Schimmel testified earlier this year at a legislative hearing that meth use and abuse is rampant across the state. Those were his words. Are you seeing an increase in meth use in the emergency room at St. Agnes Hospital?
Yes, we are. It's definitely increased over the years. Meth use has been spotty throughout the nation, and certainly emergency medicine is a fairly close-knit community, and so we get to hear from other places what the drug is, the drug of choice locally at different places around the country. It's definitely has been an increase here in Fond du Lac, which you almost never used to see positive drug screens for meth or people admitting to using meth even 5 years ago. So definitely seeing more of that the last couple of years even.
I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that, because an FBI report estimated that between 2011 and 2015 in Wisconsin, methamphetamine use expanded between 250 and 300%. I mean, that's incredible.
Yeah, I would believe it.
And we still don't see the light at the end of the tunnel when it comes to opioid addiction.
No, I don't think we've seen the light at the end of the tunnel yet. I think we still haven't seen the peak in heroin use and abuse and overdose and deaths yet here in Wisconsin and here locally in Fond du Lac. And I think we're just starting to see the influx of meth the last year or two. Well,
let me ask you this: in your career in medicine, have you ever seen a public health epidemic like the opioid methamphetamine epidemic that we're experiencing, not just here in Fond du Lac in Wisconsin, but across the country? Have we ever seen anything like this before?
Preventable, such as obesity and alcohol and other drugs, but definitely that is there as well. But as far as sudden deaths, such as with heroin, there's been definitely a big increase in that. The meth is just, like I said, is just coming in. So the answer to your question is no, I haven't seen as big of a public health issue as heroin and drugs as I have in the last 10 years.
What's in methamphetamine? There was a city truck in a parade earlier this year with a sign that said the stuff in here is the stuff in meth, a city garbage truck.
Yeah, so the problem with meth and with the part of the production in methamphetamine is it's the ingredients that goes into using it is essentially like methane and gasoline and other flammable, noxious gases that can be produced. So he's correct. Basically, the byproducts of some of the garbage is basically some of the stuff that people are putting into their body.
That's unbelievable. Is it that addictive that if you take it once, you can become addicted?
Sure.
Really?
Yeah. Yep. It's very releases lots of. It's a stimulant, and it can be extremely addicting. And you see people that have been even incarcerated, and as soon as they get out of jail, they're back using again. They still crave it even months and years later.
All right. So from a medical perspective, we know the police, the law enforcement attack on the people who are distributing meth. My understanding is a lot of the meth is not homegrown. It's being brought into Fond du Lac. But from a medical perspective, what do you think is the most important thing that needs to be done to address this problem?
I think prevention. Prevention is going to be the biggest key. Once you're trying to start to seek after treatment, you're kind of the cat's out of the bag, so to speak. It's difficult to go back because it is that addicting. It's easier, I think, to prevent than to try to do drug treatment.
Emergency medicine physician Dr. Nathan Larson, we greatly appreciate you taking some time to talk with us about this serious issue.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Next. So program overview, we're going to talk about what is meth. We're going to talk about some area and regional trends, affects the user and the community. We're going to talk about prevention of drug abuse, treatment, harm reduction, and then at the end, we'll have some time set aside for some question and answer. Next slide. Introduction to the panelists. Seated would be to your left, working to the right. We have Brad Dunlap, Special Agent in Charge. He's with the Wisconsin Department of Justice, Division of Criminal Investigation, and he heads up the Lake Winnebago Area MEG Unit, Drug Unit. It's a four-county drug task force that is our partnership with the State of Wisconsin Department of Justice, but then police departments and sheriff's departments from throughout Fond du Lac, Winnebago, Outagamie, and Calumet counties. And most of the cities and the sheriff's offices throughout those areas we have officers, investigators signed to that unit. Brad is their boss. Seated next, well, yours truly then. Seated next to Brad then, we have our Fond du Lac County District Attorney, Mr. Eric Toney. Eric. And seated next to him, Amy Johannes, Clinical Supervisor, Addiction Services, Agnesian Healthcare, and where's Kim Miller? Kim Miller, seated out in the audience, our Fond du Lac County Health Officer. Kim, thanks. Next. Some special thanks. The folks that were primarily responsible for putting this together, making this happen tonight. Drug-Free Communities of Fond du Lac County, a couple of their employees and one of their volunteers. Ellen Sorensen, seated in the audience. Alex Berg, working the laptop for me. And seated in the way back of the room, Sandy Foote, one of their volunteers. The Fond du Lac School District, City of Fond du Lac Police Department, Fond du Lac County District Attorney's Office, Agnesian Healthcare, Fond du Lac County Health Department, the Wisconsin Department of Justice, and then if you look in your program brochure, you'll see resources tables. There are about 12 of them. Those folks are all set up outside. They all obviously been an integral part of this as well. Next slide. Special thanks for helping us get the word out on this tonight. Hopper Silk Screening and All-Star Trophy. So how many folks have seen the garbage truck with the placard on the side? The stuff that's in here is the stuff in meth? Only a couple of you? Okay, you'll see it. They're going to keep using it for a little bit. Kind of a cute play on words, kind of get people thinking about this, start talking about it. Those banners, those magnetic stickers, those things are not cheap to make. And Hoppers was kind enough to produce and then donate that to the group. And it's being used, I understand, not just here in Fond du Lac, but throughout Fond du Lac County. So, City of Fond du Lac Department of Public Works for graciously agreeing to put that thing on and off the garbage trucks as they do their routes through the city. Lamar Advertising, you may have seen on some of the digital billboards helping us advertise this town hall. Radio Plus at WFDL News, they're actually live streaming this, and they've been helping us give exposure to it. KFI News and K107, wonderful work in helping to spread the word on this. And then the Fond du Lac Reporter. So thanks to all those folks for helping us get the word out and help to start to get the ball rolling as far as that community education piece. Thanks. Yep. All right, and now our first speaker, Special Agent in Charge, Brad Dunlap.
Thanks, Chief. Thanks also to District Attorney Toney for letting me borrow his laptop here. Just real quick, by way of introduction, Chief already alluded to this. I supervise a four-county drug task force. I'm actually employed by District Attorney or Attorney General Brad Schimel. Ultimately, is my boss. So if you have any complaints, feel free to give him a call. He's my ultimate in my chain of command. So the Department of Justice has overseen the MEG unit operations since about 2002. We're the only drug task force in the state that has a supervisory chain of command of this nature. It's been very, very effective, and it's been a great pleasure to have been participating in this since that time. The Lake Winnebago Area MEG Unit comprises jurisdictionally Outagamie, Winnebago, Fond du Lac, and Calumet counties. And the Chief also alluded to this, and I'll make sure I clarify this as we go through the presentation here quickly, that some of the statistics that we're talking about are unit-wide. But it's important to understand, especially with drug enforcement and the drug issues, is that what you guys are seeing here may be slightly different than what they're having in Oshkosh and Appleton, but it's right around the corner. And we generally see trends as they start to sort of get more diffuse. A particular city may get afflicted or affected by a particular drug, and that will start to then sort of infiltrate, if you will, or affect the surrounding communities. So bear that in mind as we go through these statistics, because what the chief said is very accurate. We've had very, very few methamphetamine seizures in the city of Fond du Lac or in Fond du Lac County in the last few years. Next slide, please. But what we want to emphasize is, from a statistical standpoint, from a seizure standpoint, we've never seen anything like this drug as far as availability, with the exception of marijuana. So I'll say that again. With the exception of marijuana, we've never seen a drug from an availability standpoint become this. There's a saturated market, all right? This is the most readily available drug next to marijuana that we see on the marketplace today, all right? And these statistics are just, they're mind-blowing. Because this methamphetamine, of course, is considered a hard drug. This isn't marijuana. It's a very serious, very addictive, and very detrimental drug. And yet the seizures that we've seen, the availability of this is through the roof. And you can see that from the statistics here. We seized more meth in 2017 than heroin, cocaine, crack cocaine, and all of the other non-marijuana related drugs combined. All right, so with the exception of marijuana, methamphetamine is by far the drug that we've seized the most of. So it's a very, very alarming. Next slide, please. This just drives home the arrest statistics that we've had about the number of people that we arrest. The chief had given the statistic, about 450 to 600 arrests a year. About 85% of those arrests are felony drug arrests. So most of the arrests that you see that are methamphetamine related are felony drug arrests. All right, so of course this is a resource allocation standpoint, a resource allocation issue on how much time are we spending as a unit dealing with these types of issues. All right, so probably the meat of the presentation from my standpoint is why are we dealing with meth and why now? All right, and there's just a few, if you want to go to the next slide, please. So as we click through, there's only 4 bullet points here. I'll go through them very, very quickly. But the first thing from a historical timeline that occurred, everybody remembers the drug OxyContin. For a long time, and more so in Fond du Lac than in our other 3 counties, we had a huge problem with OxyContin. And in 2010, that drug was reformulated. And almost overnight, what happened with the reformulation is heroin just exploded. And we don't have time to get into why that was. For those of you who attended the summit, we gave a quick little diatribe on why that was. But heroin became very, very prevalent. Heroin's produced in Colombia. The heroin that we use in this community is produced in Colombia. The Colombians also produce cocaine, all right? And they made a conscious decision as a cartel, or the cartels, to start producing less cocaine and start producing more heroin. They diversified their product line. And because of that, there was less less cocaine that was available to the drug traffickers in Chicago and Milwaukee, which is where we were getting our supply of crack. And as a consequence, next slide, we started to see the crack cocaine availability and our crack seizures dropped precipitously. All right, there was, we would say we couldn't buy a rock of crack in this community to save our lives for a couple of years, which sounds on its face like a good thing. The problem is many of those users then switched over to heroin. So we had a gap or a missing link, if you will, in the stimulant drug market in Fond du Lac, all right, or in our area. Next slide, please. And what we then saw on the heels of that were the meth labs starting to proliferate. In 2000, and there's a slide coming up here, I'll say it's 2013 or 2014, in our 4-county area, we accounted for half of the state's meth labs. And for those of you who follow this kind of stuff, if you remember 10, 15 years ago, most of the meth labs were in northern Wisconsin or southwestern Wisconsin. We have very few meth labs in our area. And that flip-flopped, again, on the heels of the heroin epidemic. So it's important to understand the interplay between these 2 drugs. And then next slide. Let's go back one if you could, Alex, sorry. Thank you. So the ice availability, and we're going to talk about 2 different types of meth tonight. The first is what's called the P2P meth, which is the Mexican meth, and the second is the meth labs, which, knock on wood, continue to decline or decrease because those things are very, very nasty. It's the same chemical, but it's manufactured slightly differently. And so we have different routes of importation, different routes of manufacture. So if we can go to the next slide. So this is, of course, just like the movie or the series Breaking Bad. The P2P method, the Mexican meth, these are made in what's called super labs, 5, 10, 50-pound batches out in the desert someplace. Could be in residences. And it's made in a slightly different manufacture method than the meth that's made from ephedrine. all right? So it's a slightly different chemical manufacture process, but they are making bulk quantities of this stuff. And this is imported from Mexico or the southwestern part of the United States, okay? And this is the drug, when we're talking about meth seizures going through the roof, this is the drug that we're talking about, specifically is ice, okay? So this stuff isn't made in bathtubs here in town. We'll talk about that in just a few minutes, all right? So the, let's see, next slide, please. So the average, if you want to say, or typical seizure that we used to make for ice was in the 1/8 of an ounce, 1/2 ounce, all right? Very, very small quantities. Then we started to see a few of the independent drug traffickers or small drug trafficking organizations that were bringing this stuff up, importing it either through Minneapolis, if it's the Asian street gangs, or through Chicago and Milwaukee, if it's the Mexican street gangs that are bringing this stuff up. Or a third route of importation was just independent traffickers, people like us that are the users that are also involved in trafficking this stuff up from Los Angeles, from Texas, or directly from Mexico. So those are our 3 routes of importation. And what we've seen over the last 3 years is that average seizure has continued to increase in size. So now it's not uncommon for us to seize, here it's just about a pound of methamphetamine. This was a couple of weeks ago. And it's not uncommon for us to be seizing 1/4 pounds, 1/2 pounds of meth. The price of this stuff used to be, when this, about 4 or 5 years ago, this stuff used to cost about $15,000 a pound. Now it costs between $3,000 and $5,000 a pound. And of course, what does that tell us from an economic standpoint? There's a glut of supply. There's tons of this stuff available. Next slide. One of the other methods that we see with the importation of this stuff is via parcel carriers. So UPS, FedEx, United States Postal Service. Because of the size of this, of course, a pound of meth will fit just in a shoebox. It's very, very convenient for them to send this stuff through the mail, just like they would with marijuana, cocaine, and some of the other harder drugs. Next slide. And I'm just clicking through or showing you some of the appearances of some of the bulk shipments. This is an ounce of meth. Here it was concealed in what we call a California safe. This is a fairly typical quantity that we'll catch somebody with who's what we'll call like a mid-level dealer in the area here. All right. Next slide. And then we get down to the end user quantities. It's usually sold in grams, 1/2 gram, sometimes 1/8 of an ounce, or what's called 8 balls. And the price, again, has become drastically less than when we first started seeing this drug. You're looking at about $100 to $150 a gram. And that may sound like a lot of money, okay, very similar to what cocaine would cost for that. But understand that when you take a hit of this stuff, and the chief will go over some of the effects, when you take a hit of this stuff, you're up for 12 to 18 to 24 hours. All right, so it's a very, very potent stimulant. All right, next slide. A single dose is usually considered about 1/10 of a gram, just like 1/10 of a gram of cocaine is considered a dose or a hit, or 1/10 of a gram of heroin is considered a dose or a hit. And again, that's going for about $100 to $150 on the street. And you can see how it's packaged, very, very common. Those little gem packs are only about this big, postage size stamp. Same thing with the little foilies. The gem packs are probably the most common method that we see this stuff stored in. All right. And then last but not least, one of the more disturbing trends that we've seen with ice, next slide please. Traditionally this stuff was smoked, and you see these little pipes, and I apologize, I forgot to bring it. Check when you go to the gas stations at the register. They used to sell those little flowers in the glass tubes, right? And you all know those are just crack pipes. That's what they were selling, just little cloth flowers in little glass tubes. Now in certain parts of the valley, instead of the glass tubes, what you get is a flower that's put inside one of these little glass tubes with the bulb at the end, all right? And they say they have some clever names for them, but all it is a meth pipe that they're selling. So check out your gas stations and see, because that's a great indicator, right, in the community. Do you have a crack problem? You're going to have the straight tubes with the flowers in them. If you have a meth problem, you're going to start to see these in the gas stations. Just a great little litmus test or indicator. But one of the more disturbing trends that we've seen with methamphetamine now is it's starting to be injected. All right, and that's particularly, I don't want to say concerning, but it used to be if we saw a kit, a rig, or a tourniquet, we'd know that we have a heroin addict on our hands. Not so much anymore. Really the only difference between the injection of methamphetamine and the injection of heroin is heroin, you're going to see char marks on the cooker because they're purifying it or getting it to melt but methamphetamine and ice will dissolve at room temperature, so they won't have to heat their solution before they inject it. So that's really the only difference that you'll see. Otherwise, the paraphernalia looks exactly the same for somebody who's injecting meth, and we have seen a pretty good increase in the number of people that are doing that. All right. Next slide. So this, fortunately, the good news is with the methamphetamine labs, and you'll see that in the stat I'll show you in just a second here, our meth labs are way down. And the reason for that, quite frankly, is because of the amount of ice that's available. All right? Most addicts, right, 9 out of 10 addicts surveyed say that they would much rather use ice than crank or the stuff that's made in the bathtubs. All right? There's a fascinating history of meth manufacture, and if you're really into that kind of stuff, comes to one of my other presentations. We talk about it. It's very involved, and it's very interesting about how this drug has evolved over the years in this country. But the long story short, next slide, is most of the labs that we're seeing now are what's called these one-pot cooks. All right, very, very small, very, very volatile, very, very mobile, and very, very fast. Traditionally, the two methods of making methamphetamine, depending on which one you use, would take about maybe 2 to 3 hours to whip up a batch of this stuff. This thing, these one-pot cooks, you can have a batch whipped up in about 30 minutes to 45 minutes, if you know what you're doing, all right? And each one of these cooks is going to generate about 1/10 of a gram to 1/2 of a gram, a 1/2 of a gram to a gram of finished product. Doesn't sound like a lot, but remember, a dose is 1/10 of a gram, and that single 1/10 of a gram is going to keep you up for 12 to 24 hours. So it packs a punch. They estimate that about 1 in 3 of these things will explode or catch fire. Extremely volatile. If you ever see something like this, you don't want to touch it, because just touching it or agitating it, if there's solution that's still left in there, it can reinitiate that reaction. But it's a very, very simple process. We'll just go through the chemicals quickly. Next slide. This will give you the statistical data, which is the good news. Okay, so it was 2014. That was there was about 42 meth labs in the state that were dismantled in 2014. We had 20 of them here in the valley. So the good news is again, as the ice increases, the availability of ice increases, our meth labs are decreasing. We hope that continues. One of the things we're looking at from the national level is, of course, the current administration at the federal level is very much engaged in border security, and one of the potential unintended consequences of increased border security, if it's harder to get ice across the border, we're going to start to see the meth labs come back. So that's a potential negative consequence. Next slide. So we're just going to go through this really quickly. The precursor for this type of methamphetamine is ephedrine, or Sudafed. Just like the stuff you take for your head colds, it's but one molecule, I forget, oxygen or a carbon atom away from methamphetamine. It's very, very similar. Sudafed is very, very similar to finished methamphetamine, which is why it's so effective at getting rid of our head colds. But when we take Sudafed, of course, we take a couple of tablets, as directed, and then we use a couple of, doses out of the box, and then it sits on our shelf until it expires. So when we see something like this, that's not normal. We don't normally see somebody who's punched out every one of those capsules or tablets in order to get the ephedrine. Extract the ephedrine from the tablets. So this is the precursor for the drug. Next slide. And one of the things that's made the one-pot lab so attractive is the availability of ammonium nitrate in these cold packs. All right, so this is another one of the ingredients. They're looking for there's 2 types of cold packs. The ones that contain ammonium nitrate are the ones that they'll use. They'll tear them open, dump out the ammonium nitrate crystals. If you click to the next slide. It says, warning, do not open this pack. So they'll tear the pack open, so that's a clue that they're using it to make meth. They'll just dump out the water bladder, and then just next slide, you'll see the ammonium nitrate crystals. This is what they look like. All right, next slide. They need lithium batteries. So if you have a cook, they'll get several packages of these things, and they'll actually just peel these batteries apart. That's all a battery is a strip of metal, lithium metal. They have to be lithium batteries. They need the lithium metal. They'll rip those into little strips, and they'll put those inside that 2-liter soda bottle with some type of a solvent. Next slide. And the solvent that they're going for now is in these Coleman fuel. They used to use starter fluid, which you can see at the bottom there, but most of the manufacturers now are using the Coleman fuel, which is in those red containers. So that's really it. They take all that, they put it in that 2-liter soda bottle, and it starts this reaction going. After about 30 minutes, you'll have meth in solution. It's a little bit of a misnomer. There's one other procedure that they'll use with hydrochloric acid, salt, and a gas can, what's called salting out the meth. And then they'll have the finished product, which I think we'll get to in a second here. Next slide, right? So there's our meth lab, right? Just making sure you guys are all still awake. Next slide. And so this is what you're left with. Unlike ice, which is very, very consistent in appearance, no matter where you get it from, ice looks pretty much the same. With crank, it depends on the type of ephedrine that you started with. It depends on some of your precursor chemicals. It's all over the roadmap on what it looks like and how efficient you are. Next slide. This one is near and dear to our heart. This is the largest single purchase, because this drug, understand, is not a drug of profit. Ice is a drug of profit. This drug is a drug of addiction, and what I mean by that is it's a lifestyle. So if we're a group of us are addicted to meth, I might be the cook. I'm the one who knows how to make this stuff. There's a term called smurfing, so I'll have the chief and the district attorney run and get me my ephedrine, and they'll come over. Right, you have to sign for the ephedrine at the store, so each one will run and get 1 pack from CVS and 1 pack from Walgreens, and then they'll bring it back to me. I'll punch out the tablets, and then maybe you'll go get the lithium batteries and peel the batteries for me, and a couple people in the front row will go get my Coleman fuel, and they'll do the coal packs for me. And we all meet back at my house, and I whip up a batch of this stuff, and then we each get 1/10 of a gram for our troubles. That's called smurfing, all right? And that's the idea behind this, these one-pot cooks. So it's not a drug of profit. This is a drug of addiction, and it's kind of like a lifestyle. Then we'll use it, and when it's all gone, we'll do that all over again and make up another batch. So this case was actually a case here in Fond du Lac, and we're blessed at our unit to have a special agent that probably has forgotten more about meth manufacture than anybody around in the state will ever know. And he did the undercover, and this guy that was making this stuff was probably one of the best cooks. He was from Iowa that we had ever encountered, and he was selling it, I think this was 10 grams, which we've never seen quantities like that being sold out of a meth lab before, at least not in this area. So feel proud. This last slide is for you guys. This was a Fond du Lac case that we worked, even though he was from Iowa. Now he's in the Fond du Lac County, well, he was, anyway, in the Fond du Lac County Jail. All right. That's all I have, Chief. Thank you.
Thanks, Brad. Okay, so now we're going to talk about, now we know what meth is, now we're going to talk a little bit about what it does to you. To begin with, picking at skin, so resulting in sores and scabs, and I'm going to show you a picture a little bit later that shows you just how bad that can be. One of the terms that you hear commonly used with folks that are abusing meth is the sensation of meth bugs. So in other words, a sensation of bugs literally crawling under their skin. That's what they think they're feeling, okay? They pick at them, they pick at them, they pick at them, and they literally rub themselves raw. Increased physical activity, as Brad said, it's a super powerful stimulant. So picture somebody taking a super powerful stimulant just constantly on the go. Heavy sweating, fatigue, next slide. Noticeable or uncontrollable jaw clenching. Now again, keep in mind, talking about a very, very powerful stimulant that will explain a lot of these symptoms that we're going to be talking about. Decline in personal hygiene and care, that's something that's common with pretty much any type of substance abuse, but as you'll see with some of the slides, and I'll show you later, it can be particularly noteworthy with individuals that are abusing meth or ice. And of course, with that comes an increasingly disheveled and physical appearance. Next. A binge crash pattern. So Mr. Dunlap talked about literally being up for hours or days on end. And so what will happen with the individuals that are using, as they're doing that binge, it's going on for a period of time, and in many instances, they're literally not sleeping, not eating. They're just on a meth binge, followed by a crash. And that crash can last days. Now, I don't know if that's, Brad, is that a stupor for 2-3 days? Oh, comatose for a period of days. So again, just think of what that does. I mean, think for most of us, what a restless night's sleep causes you to feel like the next day. Imagine being on a meth binge for literally days, not eating, not sleeping, just on that drug binge, and how bad that crash is then. And then they get up and they start it all over again because the addiction is that powerful. Doing repetitive, meaningless tasks, again, powerful stimulant. Risky behavior, including increased risky sexual behavior. Next slide. Sudden or unexplained withdrawal from activities people once enjoyed. So again, that's something that you'll see commonly with most types of substance abuse or addiction. But again, particularly noteworthy with these drugs that are more powerful. Social withdrawal from interpersonal relationships, declining work or school performance, it's pretty self-explanatory. Borrowing or stealing money, pawning property. I'm going to talk towards the end of this part of this presentation about the impact on the community. But people who develop real serious addictions oftentimes will not be, particularly with drugs like meth, they will not be gainfully employed. They've got to get that drug somehow, okay? So that's where you begin to see the borrowing money, turning to stealing money, pawning property. That can be their own property. Once that's all gone, that's where we'll start to see stealing property, to pawn it, to get the money, to get their drugs. Next slide. So now let's talk about some mental behavioral symptoms. Euphoria, everybody, that feeling of elation and paranoia, easily confused, psychosis, extreme irritability, unpredictability, hallucinations, and delusions. Next slide. More mental behavioral symptoms: depression, intense anxiety, aggression, violent outbursts, and mood swings, up 1 minute and down the next. Recall earlier on in the intro, I said that it's a different drug than heroin, but it's every bit as deadly, dangerous, and toxic. So what our officers will tell you in dealing on, frankly, a daily basis with individuals that are opioid or heroin addicts, they are, generally speaking, pretty passive. Individuals that are abusing meth, it is the complete polar opposite. They're very, very aggressive individuals, and they can be much more dangerous criminals. Now, it's not to say that somebody who isn't a heroin or opioid addict isn't going to do things like commit burglaries, commit robberies, but generally speaking, relative to the demeanor, their temperament, it's an entirely different person. People that are taking meth are, like I said, very, very violent, violent mood swings, very aggressive by nature. So where we will see, on the plus side, fewer needles, where people aren't injecting as much heroin, to the extent that there's as Mr. Dunlap indicated, the generally speaking, you'll see with meth, smoking or inhaling, so you'll be seeing fewer needles. The downside of that is that you're dealing with, again, an individual that is much more aggressive and prone to violence by nature. So next slide. Medical symptoms: nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, seizures, tremors, dry mouth, real bad breath, persistent headaches, and tooth decay, which you'll commonly hear referred to as meth mouth. I'll show you a slide of that, just how noticeable that is in just a sec. Next. Continuing on with some medical symptoms, persistent increased blood pressure and heart rate, and of course with that comes the increased risk of cardiac events, be it heart attack, stroke, or other cardiac-related events. Respiratory and breathing problems, elevated body temperature, dilated pupils, and loss of appetite, which then of course results in extreme weight loss and malnourishment. Again, I'll show you some pictures in just a minute that I think you'll find to be pretty startling. Next. So, before and after. That, folks, is the same woman. Before she began using meth and after. Next. This gentleman, before, after, I don't know if you can read that out there. That's just 2 months, folks. Just 2 months of meth abuse. Look at the changes in his physical appearance. Next. Another one. 7 months later, before, after. Now you'll see some of these open sores. Recall I said one of the symptoms are picking at the skin. Next. Early damage of meth mouth. See the decay in the teeth. Next. Major damage. Next. So I had mentioned the meth bugs. I hope that's not too blurry out there. I tried to clean that slide up as best I could, but those are the picking at the skin, And recall I said that sensation that some of them think they feel with bugs crawling under the skin. That's the subsequent result. Next. All right, so let's talk quickly about some simple tips to recognize a drug house in a neighborhood. And folks, whether it's meth trafficking, heroin, cocaine, marijuana, a lot of these tips are the same. And the general rule of thumb that I like to tell people is most of us, as we get a little bit older, you begin to kind of learn to listen to that little voice and that little gut tuition. Like, something's just not right with that house across the street, that house down the block, that house next to my kid's dorm, whatever the case might be. And so some of those, relative now to meth, especially if they're cooking, and we'll go over this quickly because Special Agent Dunlap already covered this, but glass containers, especially if you see, like a mason jar with duct tape on it. Plastic soda bottles, he showed you some pictures of that, rubber tubing, dust masks, funnels, rubber gloves, those cold compress packs, the Sudafed packs, the battery packs. Those are all, if you see those things particularly, by themselves, one by themselves, no, not so much. If you notice, a neighbor that perhaps when they have their trash out, more times than not, you'll see some of these things repetitively. Pretty good sign that they might be cooking up meth at that house. Next slide. If they're cooking meth, some of the odors that you may notice, ammonia or kind of a cat urine type of smell, ether, hospital-like smell, acetone, paint thinner, or else perhaps a vinegary or kind of a sour smell. If they're cooking meth, those are some of the odors that may be commonly noted in the immediate proximity of that house. Next. So as far as recognizing a drug house in and of itself, the biggie is always that short-term stop-and-go traffic. So car pulls up, one person runs in the house, 2 minutes later they get back in the car, off they go. 5 minutes later, here comes another car, same routine. Half hour later, another car, same routine. If you see that, folks, there's one of two things happening. They're either selling Avon or it's a drug house, okay? And I don't mean to make light of that. And if anybody out here sells Avon or anything like that, my apologies. But in all seriousness, if you see that, that is almost always a dead giveaway of a drug house. Almost always. A flop house or kind of a party house with some people coming and going that because they're abusing, especially if they're doing that binge and crash pattern, they'll look a little rough. So those houses where you see that kind of activity, particularly if it's coupled with that stop-and-go traffic, again, major red flag. Real secretive behaviors by the folks that live there, especially if they're covering their windows with blankets, foil, or when people are outside, kind of every time they go out, kind of acting like they're nervous. Recall I said one of the symptoms for meth was paranoia. So people just kind of look like they're a little nervous about something. And again, especially if it's coupled with some of these other things, pretty good indication that there's drug activity going on at that house. Next. So the impact on a community. Folks, in 2016, we had 12 armed robberies in the city of Fond du Lac. 8 of them we either know matter-of-factly or are quite confident that they were drug-related. So it was a drug deal gone bad, or it was somebody with a drug habit that had to get money to go get their drugs. 12 robberies, 8 of them we know or strongly suspect they were drug-related. Now, that's not to say that the other 4 aren't. I just can't stand up here with any conviction and tell you that they're drug-related. But that, even at that, 8 of 12, that's a pretty startling statistic. A significant number of our property crimes, thefts and burglaries, are also where you're able to peel the layers back and find out what's at the root cause. They're drug-related. So there's the impact on a community. I talked before about the very violent nature of meth abusers. I don't need to go back over that again, but except to say this. Recall I said that an individual that's addicted to heroin or opioids is generally going to be pretty passive. They might commit an armed robbery. The chances of them committing a physical act of violence against somebody in that robbery is going to be a lot less with a heroin addict than it is with a meth addict. because you're taking that emotion and that aggression, that stimulant nature of that drug out of that particular crime. Again, it can be much more dangerous criminals. And so, there were quite a few hands that were at some of the heroin summits. You heard me say this before, and I'm going to say it again because this is a really key point. I said before, no community is ever going to arrest its way out of a drug problem. It's prevention, it's education, it's harm reduction, it's treatment. Enforcement's a piece of it. But the takeaway here is that for a community to best combat any type of an addiction problem that it's dealing with, I don't care what kind of drug it is, you've got to have as many people and organizations in that community all in as possible. And what happens is people will all too often become complacent in, you know what, I'm fortunate enough, I'm blessed enough, there's nobody in my family that is suffering from addiction. And so they tend to take yeah, there might be a drug house down the street, but I'm not getting involved. Okay? The problem with that is, so let's pretend you have a 16-year-old son or daughter that goes to work at a convenience store. And one night at about 10 o'clock, one of those addicts that needs money to go buy their drugs comes in and sticks a handgun in their face. Has that drug problem now affected your family? And that's the thing that not enough people recognize, and we need people to recognize, and we need people to help spread the word. This is whether it's heroin and opioids, meth, whatever type of drug we're talking about, these are community-wide problems. And in order to best mitigate the harm in our community, you got to have people at all levels in the community, faith, schools, business community. The list goes on and on and on. Obviously, law enforcement and our prosecutions and the courts and our treatment folks, everybody's got to be all in. That's the only way you can minimize the damage to your community. And if you take one takeaway tonight, please let it be that. All right, next. So, thank you for your attention in this part of the presentation, and next up is District Attorney Eric Toney.
Thank you, Chief. I think my presentation will be a little bit shorter, and it's on prevention. And some of what we're going to talk about is, does anybody have kids in the room? So a lot of you, well, I would not be one to raise my hand, but I'll be talking with you on how to talk with your kids, which is interesting because sometimes my dog doesn't even listen to me, but we'll do our best. And some of these are just suggestions that some people smarter than I have in talking with kids, and you have to use some individualized decision-making based on how you know your kids. I've been kind of surveying the audience as I've been up there, and I've seen a lot of familiar faces in the crowd, some that I haven't seen. See Melissa, our drug court coordinator here. I see our county executive, Alan Beekle, in the room, and some of our law enforcement and social services folks. So it's really nice to see some other people that are in this system and working through this issue that we're all dealing with that are here on their own time. So it's really nice to see all of them here and all of the community here as well. But one of the things, when is the right time to talk with kids about drugs, meth, whatever it might be? And as we've kind of talked about, does it start at what age? And I think what some of you as parents know, you talk about kids at different ages about different things, and you can't always rely on school to teach kids everything, and parents have to take some of that responsibility. And this may really start when the kids are in middle school around the age of 10, moving up to the age of 14, and making sure that who are your kids' friends? I know I grew up here in the city of Fond du Lac. I had a great group of friends, and that can be one of the most important things that your kids have. And it might be making sure they have good friends, and if they're staying overnight somewhere, they tell you that the parents might be there, but some of you have probably been tricked by that before, where lo and behold, the parents aren't there, and you need to be contacting those parents and making sure they're there, because you can have those conversations with your kids, but you have to trust but verify what they're telling you and make sure that they have good friends and that you're having these discussions and building that trust with your children. And who are they being exposed to? Because as most of you probably know, the difference between elementary school and middle school can be significantly different based on some of the age differences between kids as they start to get older. And peer pressure is up on the slide. You've probably all seen The Christmas Story, and many of you are probably looking forward to the 24-hour marathon like I am as we get closer to Christmas, or maybe you're like my mom and just not a big fan of the movie. But middle school is a really important time for kids as they're making new friends, and there's different elementary schools where you've got a bunch of kids pouring in, and can be a tough time for kids making friends. And that's where, as parents, you really need to make sure you're there and paying attention to what's going on. And I know it can be tough when, as parents, you have jobs, sometimes multiple jobs and multiple kids and a lot of things going on. It's definitely important. High school is equally important, because now you've got kids that are 14 to 18 years old. Kids are driving, maybe a very scary moment for parents. I'm thankful my dog can't drive. But there's definitely a lot going on, and now you've got multiple middle schools pouring into high schools. And is anyone here live in the city of Fond du Lac? Anyone have kids going to Fond du Lac High School? See, one hand, I was part of the first graduating class of Fond du Lac High School back in 2002 and spent a little time here at Goodrich. And you've got a lot of different kids that are coming in together, and really making sure you're having those conversations and talking with them and asking them questions, and making sure that not just asking them questions, but what should they do when they're confronted with this situation. Sometimes we turn our blinker on because it's habit. We just know what to do because we've practiced it, we've been taught it, we've gone through driver's ed. Well, it can be the same thing when you're talking about drugs. When somebody that they thought was a good friend of theirs now wants to ask them if they want to do some drugs or go somewhere. You need to teach your kids certain things that they can do, which might involve a little bit of role playing. And there's some examples up on the PowerPoint up here on different ways on what you can train your kid to say. And I'm not going to tell you specifics, because some of you probably have some better ideas on how to talk to kids than I do. But it's making sure that you're talking with kids about those things, and how can they use these tools. We're in that uncomfortable situation where they can deflect it, get out of there. Maybe you want them to call you, text you, message you, whatever it might be, so that you can come and pick them up. Making sure that that's just habit for them, that when they get put in this situation, they're going to safely leave the situation. They're going to contact you. If you're not available, there's somebody else there that they can contact and get out of this situation. And just working with them and practicing. And just like if, in school we have fire drills, and what happens when the fire alarm goes off? All the kids get in line, they all get out of the building, and you hope it's nice and orderly. Well, making sure that you practice these situations with kids so they're not frozen and saying, oh my gosh, what do I do? This person is offering me meth, marijuana, heroin, whatever it might be, cocaine, alcohol, tobacco, whatever it might be. These apply to all of those different things, and some of you are probably already doing that or have done that with your kids. And maybe one of the tougher questions when the kids say, well, have you ever done drugs? How do you handle that situation? That's a tough one. I don't have kids. I'm not going to pretend to tell you how to do that. Somebody may be honest and use it as a teachable moment and describe how you felt, what happened, experiences you've had as a parent. Maybe you're not comfortable sharing that information with kids and you take a different approach, but you have to, as a parent, be prepared. Just like you want your kid to be prepared so they're not frozen. But I mean, when the kids ask about the birds and the bees, if you're not prepared, you probably have that, deer in the headlights look. Well, this can be the same question when you're talking about drugs. When they say, well, mom or dad, or if you're an aunt or an uncle, or if you're the babysitter, and they're asking you these questions, you have to be prepared and ready to know what are you going to say to that child so that you don't have that deer in the headlights look. It's very important. And equally important is the next slide that Alex is bringing up, is being a parent and not a pal. I have the luxury with my dog of being his pal, maybe too much sometimes, but as a parent of a child, you don't have that luxury. And there's an acronym up there that you can read, but it's important. And I'm not going to sit here and, like I said before, lecture folks on how to be a parent, given that I'm not raising any kids. But they asked the youngest person to talk about this, so I don't know if Ellen was trying to punish me by asking me to do that. But I just wanted to give some thoughts to folks and make sure that as you're leaving here today from this prevention piece, is make sure that you're staying engaged with your children. Make sure that you're talking with them about this. And sometimes you think, well, gee, they're in middle school and they've got great friends. I don't need to talk to them about it, or the school's got a program for that, right? Anybody remember the DARE program or the ACE program? I mean, they come in for a little bit. It's not every year. It's not all year round. That there's, you need to supplement those as a parent and continue to do those kind of things and not just rely on the programming that your school may have. So it's making sure that you're engaged and having these, what sometimes can be difficult conversations with the kids. And then we've got some, a slide, which I don't think I'll talk about, on how to spot drug use, because I think Chief Lamb talked about some of those things. So I'm going to end my presentation and turn it over to Amy's capable hands. Thank you.
So I have the luxury of talking about treatment. You can just go right to slide 8, Alex. Well, actually 9. So how do we treat the addiction of methamphetamine? And actually here in Fond du Lac, we're really fortunate because we actually have 2 facilities, and they're within half a block of each other. So we have Fond du Lac Department of Community Programs and Agnesian Behavioral Health. And so both of them provide substance abuse services. And next slide, please. Some of the barriers, before I get into the next session, is, and I'm not sure if it's really barriers or just things to keep in mind as we're treating methamphetamine as it comes into the area, is there's currently no medication, FDA medication, that's approved for the treatment of methamphetamine. So unlike when we were treating opioid and heroin addiction, we could assist individuals through the withdrawal process, or to provide medication that actually assisted them to continue recovery. So we could give them Suboxone, Vivitrol, or naltrexone. But with methamphetamine, there currently isn't any medications that can assist. And as Chief Lamb shared, methamphetamine is a very difficult addiction to get over. And so we oftentimes see when individuals come into treatment that the high that they were receiving, when they stop using, they go so low that in order to go back to that high, because then they return to their active addiction just because the low is so low. And we can't prevent or assist them with medication to get through that. One of the other things that is similar with regards to methamphetamine addiction and opiate addiction is that it does not meet medical necessity for an inpatient treatment. And that can be very frustrating. So as somebody who needs or desires assistance with their addiction, or you finally talk a family member into coming into an emergency department for treatment, they show up and they're told, sorry, that does not meet the criteria for an inpatient setting, and then they're turned away. So when we're looking at, when we do see individuals on inpatient, and both Fond du Lac Department of Community Programs, they have an acute unit, and Agnesian have an inpatient treatment center. When we're seeing individuals that are being admitted to these facilities, it's because they arrive and they're showing up in our emergency department with hallucinations, psychosis, the depression, suicidal thoughts, homicidal thoughts as a result of their active addiction. So if they arrive in the emergency department with those symptoms, they definitely meet criteria for an inpatient stay. Next slide. Along with that, you saw several slides with medical things that occur as a result of methamphetamine. And so it won't be unusual for individuals to perhaps show up in our emergency department or even in their primary care physician offices with infections from the picking that occurs, or cardiac arrest, high blood pressure. And in those cases, when individuals arrive in the emergency department or primary care with those symptoms, then that would probably meet admission for a medical floor, and then their symptoms would be treated. Next slide. Currently, there are no gold standards for treatment. The treatments that are listed up there, they're already in place at both Fond du Lac Department of Community Programs and at Agnesian Healthcare. We all provide the CBT, the cognitive behavioral therapy. We also have implemented into contingency management. And I'm looking at Melissa because way back when she started developing the drug court program, the drug court, she already implemented contingency reinforcement in that program for the participants. And then the matrix model is just a model that engages individuals in individual group counseling, family counseling, along with group attending AA or NA in the community. And again, both Fond du Lac Department of Community Programs and Agnesian has those in place. Next slide. So I kind of already covered this. So if somebody comes into our acute unit or into our behavioral health unit, how you access that service is that an individual has to be medically cleared. So if somebody does show up into the emergency department and they are medically cleared, that is the only way that at that point they would be admitted into inpatient behavioral health or to the acute unit. And again, it's because we want to make sure that they meet that level of care so insurance covers it. Next slide. One of the programs that we offer at Agnesian is we do provide day treatment. And day treatment is a program that runs 7 days a week from 8 to 4. And individuals engage in different groups throughout the day, individual counseling. The nice thing about the day treatment program is that individuals get to go home at night and spend time with their families and return back to treatment the following day. We also, at times, if individuals are struggling, maybe weekends are high risk, we can enter them into the day treatment program on a Saturday, a Sunday, discharge them after programming, and they can go back to their work or employment on Monday. Next slide. So DCP, Fond du Lac Department of Community Programs, and Agnesian Healthcare offers outpatient, which is the least restrictive treatment available. And even we offer initial AODA assessments, we offer individual and family counseling. The group sessions that are offered, they may look a little bit different. So we call our intensive outpatient program IOP, and that meets 5 days a week. And our IOP program is flexible. So individuals, if they need treatment, they can come 5 days a week initially. Once they become more stable, they can step down to 4 days a week, 2 days a week, however many days that they want to come. If after a period of time they're not even in IOP group and they wake up and they're having a bad day, they can call and come into group. DCP, Fond du Lac Department of Community Programs, they have POP, which is their primary outpatient program. And that program runs 4 days a week from 8:30 to 11:30. And typically individuals would attend 20 sessions, but again, if a person is in that treatment program and somebody is struggling, clearly a clinician would say they can remain in that program a little longer. Two of the more different programs, or the newest programs at facilities, are we offer a seeking safety group at Agnesian, and that's for individuals who are struggling with trauma and addiction. And one of the newer programs over at Department of Community Programs is they actually have a relapse prevention group that's women specific. So that's very exciting and clearly needed. Next slide. On top of the fact that we have the 2 inpatient facilities in Fond du Lac, we also have 3 excellent residential facilities. We have Blandine, Beacon House, and Mahalis Hope. And so what these facilities do is they actually offer longer-term treatment. So individuals can go to this level of care and stay 30, 60, or 90 days. The thing we have to be careful with residential treatment is that unless a person can pay privately, all the funding for residential treatment currently goes through Fond du Lac Department of Community Programs. So as much as we would all love to refer our patients to residential care. It's costly. And again, I think we look at the need for treatment versus financially what's available. And so we have to be creative in how we treat our patients. We start with the least restrictive treatment, and if individuals are still struggling with the least restrictive, then we go to the higher level of care and eventually look at residential care. Next slide. So if you're in the audience and you're a family member, you're saying, okay, so what about me? At Agnesian Healthcare, we offer a family education program, and it's a 4-week program, and it's offered at different times throughout the year. And it's a cash program. So each of the sessions are $10, so $40 for all 4 weeks. And the focus of that group or the program is you learn about the disease of addiction, and then you also learn how to take care of yourself while either your loved one is active in addiction or if the person is starting early recovery. And then Fond du Lac Department of Community Programs offers a family education group, and that group meets once a week. And if you are interested in getting into that group, what you would do is call and schedule with one of their addiction counselors, and then they would refer you to that group. And that group is open-ended, so you can stay in that group as long as you need to. One of our newer groups that we offer at Agnesian is our Adolescent Affected Family Member Group. And this is, again, set up very similar to our adult family education program. It's a cash program. It's offered on Sunday mornings, so young adults don't have to miss school. And it focuses on, they learn about the disease of addiction and how to survive it. The next one. So knowing that all these programs exist, but how, the bottom line, how do you access them and get into them? So I could talk about insurance and what facility takes what, but the bottom line is the number on the left for Agnesian. During the day, if you call the top one, you would be referred to our outpatient, and they would do an intake on you. They would gather information and determine whether where you need it, whether you need an appointment for us. Sometimes I can hear our support staff say, oh, like somebody will call with a drunk driving, and they'll say, well, we're sorry, we'll have to transfer you over to Fond du Lac Department of Community Programs. That's where you need to get your initial assessment. So the staff work back and forth between the two facilities. Fond du Lac Department of Community Programs is fortunate enough that they actually have a crisis line, so throughout the day, and a crisis worker during the day. So if you're struggling or you have questions, you can call either of the numbers on the right-hand side. After hours, it would be the 3535, and somebody will assist you and teach, kind of guide you to where you need to go. Next. So a reminder that overcoming methamphetamine addiction is difficult. However, it's not impossible. Years back, people thought that the disease, if you were abusing methamphetamine, that you would never recover, and that's not the case. We really just need to get people into the right treatment at the right time. Next slide. So in closing, it's important to recognize and remember that recovery can be a long-term process. It can mean that an individual has to go through multiple episodes of treatment in order to be successful. If we compare it to treatment of cancer, if somebody were to go into treatment and have a treatment of chemotherapy and it didn't take or it didn't work, the doctors wouldn't say, well, they just didn't want treatment. They're not ready. They would meet back with that person and say, okay, how can we work with you and make you more, what other treatments would you like? Let's put you through another stint and see how it works. Also, there's a thought that individuals have to be voluntary in treatment in order to be effective, and that's not the case. If you look at drug court, people are very, very effective. The other thing is that if a person shows up in my office and they're referred and they have a probation agent or they have a social worker, or they're on deferred prosecution through the DA's office, to me that means is that they have a stronger net, a stronger support of people to make them more successful in their recovery. So there is hope, and again, I think really the longer we can keep individuals into treatment, the more successful they will be. Bottom line, I think the work through drug-free communities and our 4-pillar approach, the one thing that really has come out of the sadness of our opiate epidemic in our area is that we're all starting to talk. The walls are coming down between different treatment providers. We have people in rooms. We're actually reaching out to those that are affected by active addiction, asking them, what do you need? How can we help you? And so we're really seeing positive outcomes in our community. And methamphetamine, we're being very proactive. And so I think that if we continue down that journey, we'll just see a healthier community.
Thanks, Amy. All right, let's take it home now. So in conclusion, folks, what can you do for us? What can you do to help yourselves? What can you do to help our community? Most importantly, and yes, I use the double negative intentionally, so are there any English teachers out here? My apologies if I'm making you squirm in your seat. Whatever you do, don't do nothing. That is the worst thing that we can do, okay? More specifically, if you believe, if you know somebody that's involved in drug use or trafficking, or even if you suspect it might be occurring, I gave you some of those tips on what a drug house looks like, or you overhear people talking about it, err on the side of caution and report it. And I've got a number up here for the City of Fond du Lac Police Department, for the Fond du Lac County Sheriff's Office if you live outside the city limits, or for the Lake Winnebago Area MEG Drug Unit. And of course, if you're in North Fondy, Ripon, whatever other community you have another police department, I just didn't have enough room to put everybody's phone numbers up there. So make that call. Don't worry about well, I'm not positive, so I don't want to make the call because I don't want to bother you, I don't want to waste your time, I don't want it to seem like I cry wolf and it really wasn't happening. Let us worry about that. We would much, much rather people err on the side of caution, call us and say, I don't know what's going on down the street, but something just doesn't look right, here's what I'm seeing, and just leave it at that. We'll check into it, and if it's a drug house, great. Maybe it was one that was not on our radar, and now it is. Okay, but please have the courage to do that. And remember what I said before. Don't fall into that sense of complacency or naivete, however you want to look at it, if you're one of the fortunate ones that's blessed to not have some type of addiction inside of your family or inside your circle of friends or loved ones. Because just like that robbery scenario that I used, or when you're gone on vacation and you come back and somebody burglarized your house, and now forevermore you feel violated, you don't feel safe in your own home. Don't think for 1 second that because you might be blessed enough to not have this type of a curse in your family, that it's not going to affect you just like that. So again, don't do nothing. Next. Help a friend or loved one seek treatment if you know somebody that has, whether they're using meth, or again, the more common one we're still dealing with here is the opioids and heroin. But the same can be held true for crack, for any type of substance abuse, any type of addiction. Even if it means tough love. And what do I mean by tough love? If you try and you try and you try and they won't get themselves the help they need, and it's getting worse and they're spiraling down, sometimes it's easy to not easy, sometimes it's acceptable to say, you know what, when you hit rock bottom, you'll figure it out and you'll get yourself the help you need. The problem is, with drugs like heroin, opioids, meth, rock bottom might be the morgue. And bless those people that have had to deal with a death in the family from some type of an addiction that somebody just was not able to get themselves out of that rut. But learn from those instances because they happen far too commonly in our community and communities across the state and the nation. So please, just I know that when it could be easy enough to say, that tough love might mean, you might be my son or my daughter, but I'm turning you into the police because you're just not getting yourself the help you need. And I'd rather have you hate me for a long time than having to go to your funeral. Tough reality, I know, but please, folks, understand that. Join drug-free communities. If you want information on how to get involved, got a lot of people that are involved in drug-free communities from a professional working context, but we also have a whole lot of volunteers that help us make it happen. We are making a difference. We will continue to make a difference, but we need people to continue to help to get involved with us. If you want information on that, just contact any one of us afterwards or anywhere down the road. We're all pretty easy to find on the internet, and we'll get you hooked up with any of the different work groups that we have. Minimally, folks, just help us spread the word. Amy just mentioned we're being proactive about meth. Again, we're probably going to start to see, and I know that the folks up in the Neenah, Menasha, Appleton area won't mind if I say this. They're dealing with, was it 3-1, Brad, last year? Meth over heroin up in the north end? Yeah, 3-1 quantities meth over heroin. It's that close. And again, we're starting to see it increasingly more so here. So help us get the word out about what you learned tonight. There's a lot of stuff you can find online, most of everything you saw tonight. Help us spread the word inside your families, your workplaces, social groups, whatever the case might be, and help us spread that word that this is not, just like the heroin and opioids, this is not a drug that can be taken lightly. And if we don't start working proactively towards it, or keep working proactively towards it, get more members of the community engaged in doing so, meth has the potential to have every bit the epidemic effect on our community that the heroin and opioid crisis did, or is. So please understand that, and again, don't do nothing. And next. All right, that's it. So surveys, yes. Everybody receives surveys. If you would, please fill those out. We'll do something like this somewhere down the road. The feedback that you give us will help us kind of customize what we speak of. And if anybody has any questions, now is the time that any of the four of us will help entertain those. So, no questions? We did that good a job of informing you?
How often do you see in the schools?
Brad, you want to?
Yeah, I'd say the youngest person that we've arrested for meth trafficking, and they were a fairly significant meth trafficker, was 19. So we do see the use in the schools. It's definitely in the high schools. But the more significant traffickers that we've arrested have been just past the high school age. But as far as use goes, yeah. Eric, I don't know if you have anything to add as far as high school age use.
Okay, any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Why do you say that meth does not meet the necessity remission for inpatient?
Typically, unless there's other complications, the actual withdrawal from methamphetamine is not dangerous. And so it wouldn't medically meet, so insurance is saying they don't need to be at that high level of care, that they can be treated in an outpatient basis. It would technically, if let's say they don't meet the inpatient level of care and they start outpatient, and then they're still struggling, then we could refer to a higher level, which would be our day treatment program. And then if they still were struggling, then we would refer to residential care and start to look at that. Or we could look at, there's different treatments as well. Sometimes we refer to Rogers, we refer to Pathways or Gateways. There are different treatment facilities that we can refer to. But most of the time, I think our best treatment will be when individuals show up with more of the mental health component. They'll meet the inpatient. And I think after individuals like Chief Lamb shared, when you're up for days without sleep, the mental health is going to be the one that is going to surface before the actual detox.
Okay, other questions? Yes, sir.
Can you touch briefly on carfentanil and fentanyl, and specifically just a question that I've read articles in the New York Times and things like that where it's just an incredibly toxic drug to the point where if you're even going to investigate the scene, you've got to have gloves, you've got to have an auto injector on you in case you can get, you know, in case you get come in contact with it and start suffering the effects. But since it's so deadly or so powerful, why is a dealer trying to put that in there in the drugs they're using anyway? I mean, isn't the idea with a deal that you're trying to keep the customer coming back and not kill them?
Yeah, the patrol. I'm going to turn the mic over to Special Agent Dunlap in a second. He can talk more broadly about its presence in the drug trafficking world. Yes, relative to the exposure for first responders, such as police officers. Yeah, that's very real. As a matter of fact, we've just recently spent a whole lot of money inside of our department to get, and had some great help by the folks with the emergency room in Agnesian, to get masks and protective gowns and clothing, and put protocols in place to protect our officers from those unknown substances. There have been instances where officers have been unknowingly exposed to fentanyl, and it's resulted in overdose. So that's where Narcan comes in to do hopefully try to save their lives. So yes, it's a very deadly, very real phenomena. And as far as the exposure into the drug world, I'll turn it over to Mr. Dunlap here.
Yeah, so we've had 4 confirmed overdoses in the Valley, 3 in Appleton, 1 in Neenah, that had carfentanil involvement. And amazingly, one of them actually survived, which surprised me. Carfentanil is sort of the top of the pile as far as the potency of the different fentanyl analogs. It's 10,000 times more potent than morphine. The lethal dose in humans is 2 micrograms, which is infinitesimally small. You can't see it, you can't detect it. And the 2 hazards that it poses to humans are transdermal. So if you get it in your skin, in your eyes, it can absorb through your skin and kill you, or more commonly, inhalation. And those are the ways that people will get exposed to it. Why people cut their drugs with this particular? So fentanyl, of course, by itself is a transdermal patch that's been around for a long time. It's often with palliative care or post-surgical. It's not widely prescribed, but it's very effective. But it's designed to be a consistent release when you put the patch on. So it's designed in order to release a small amount. It's also measured in micrograms, a small amount of the drug into the bloodstream on a consistent basis. All of the other knockoffs, the analogs, furanylfentanyl, methylfentanyl, acetylfentanyl, and carfentanil, carfentanil is an elephant tranquilizer, a horse tranquilizer. The other drugs are analogs that are mostly manufactured in China and then exported here illegally. So it's illegal to manufacture them in China and export them. That is done anyway, and then through the dark web, they're brought into this country. We've worked a number of cases where we're intercepting parcels of this stuff in any different types of quantities, small quantities for personal use up to larger quantities. The problem is oftentimes that the trafficker who's cutting the dope with the fentanyl product doesn't understand what type of fentanyl they're cutting it with. And that's where you're going to have these, I call them mass extinction events, where you're going to have, depending on the jurisdiction, you'll have 10, 20, 100. We've had cases in Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, where 150 people have died over the course of a weekend because there's a hot batch, as I'll call it, of carfentanil-laced heroin on the streets. And the people who are cutting it just don't realize what they're doing. They don't understand the potency, and they don't even know what product it is that they're using to cut it. Pass that on also with the fact that the dealer might not warn the user, right? So if I'm dealing to 20 different people and I don't warn those people that this is a hot batch, as we call it, they're going to use the same amount they used last week, which might be 100 times more potent than what they used last week. And when we're dealing with a narcotic, that's instant death. So good question, but yeah, and it's here. So don't think for a minute that it's not. They made a big deal out of the case in Milwaukee. We've had 4 confirmations. Again, 3 in Appleton, 1 in Neenah. So.
Okay, other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Is there any legal recourse for the, what was I thinking, like the pipes that are being sold in
I'll be honest, that was news to me when Brad shared that. So it would all depend on some of the specifics, because if it's specific to drug paraphernalia, that's definitely a crime that could be charged. But I think we'd have to look at it and see what the primary purpose of it is, and it might be one of those things where, as much as we want to be able to, I want to say like make everything illegal, but there are some things that we just aren't able to fix with laws based on what the product is, but can be used for something else, unfortunately.
And of course, what do they say on that? Of course, these have little roses in them, little cloth roses, so that's going to be their excuse. And when you go into the head shops that sell the paraphernalia, that's a lot more overt in its use. What does it say on the display case? For display only, or for tobacco use only. So there's a number of different tricks of the trade that they'll use to get around the legal. To paraphrase the definition of drug paraphernalia in the state, it's anything that has been used or is intended to be used to ingest or store a controlled substance. The statute's a lot longer than that, but that is paraphrasing it, because I didn't go to law school. So, but that's it in a nutshell. If we go in and we ask this person, what is it that this is intended for? They say, well, it's just a pretty flower inside this pipe here, and that's what they're going to tell us. So we're unable to prosecute them based on that admission.
Can I do a follow-up on a different question? Probably about 15 years ago, I had a chart at one time from an agency within the state that was given out to, like hardware stores and places like that, showed some of the quantities of things. Be aware of the quantities that are being sold. Is that still, something like that still available? Because I'm even thinking about putting, that rose pipe, putting that on a chart with that too, so that parents can learn about some of these things.
That's a good question. For the meth paraphernalia and the meth precursors, you can go onto the DOJ website, and there is links that will take you to various different places where posters like that are available. There's definitely a lot of different websites on the internet that have posters for educators that are free that you can get, or for stores or for retail establishments. As far as the sort of the paraphernalia poster in general, I'd suggest if you go onto the DEA website. Difficult to navigate, but they would have, again, links to other agencies and places that would have those types of, things to look for. Unfortunately, one of the problems with stuff like that is it's kind of generic, and your best bet is to get one of these presentations to your group or to your area, just like we're doing here tonight, to talk about the specific types of paraphernalia that are being used in this jurisdiction.
Yes, ma'am.
From a treatment standpoint, is our community positioned and adequately resourced to deal with another influx of addiction and dealing with folks in recovery?
I feel we are. I think that's one of the things that has come out of the opiate epidemic, is that we have had to become more creative in how we serve large quantities of individuals and do quality care, but still get individuals where they need to get in a timely fashion. So I think that we're also looking at expanding, but I think between both Fond du Lac Department of Community Programs and Agnesian, we have learned that we have to kind of look at how we get people into treatment much faster and keep them in treatment longer. But no, I think we can handle it. And if not, then we step back and look at it. But I think, again, through drug-free communities, we're having those discussions with individuals. We're looking at where the gaps in our treatment and what we have to improve on. But I think we're in a good direction.
Yes, sir.
I would disagree that we're just catching up now, given some of the work that Drug Free Communities has done. We were the first community in the whole state that had a drug drop box. Not to say that we're perfect, and as you outlined, there's some work that has to be done, but from what I've seen, some of our community partners, whether it's Agnesians, government, law enforcement, have really stepped up as their work that needs to be done. Absolutely, when we talk about jobs, there are jobs in this community, and when we talk to employers, one of the difficulties they have is finding people that they can keep that are able to pass drug tests. And so some of these treatment and prevention things are areas we need to improve on, but Fond du Lac County is not alone. And you brought up a really interesting point that, basically what you're saying is we're an hour from Green Bay, we're an hour from Madison, we're an hour from Milwaukee. So we're this hub where, everything kind of is. And so that's an advantage for us, and it can be a disadvantage regarding veterans. One of the things we do have the option of Veterans Court, which is in Sheboygan County, that we have that opportunity to treat post-traumatic stress disorder and some of those things that some of our veterans have experienced, but not every veteran is eligible for those programs. But I agree with you, we have work to do, and that's part of what this group is here today, and drug-free communities and some of the other things we're working on. But if you've got some ideas that you'd like to share with us afterwards, we'd be happy to sit down and talk with you.
Go ahead.
How many of these people in all of this, and people who are using, have any of you guys sat down and figured out are homeless and end up in the shelters? And then why is the communication better between the police department or the district attorney's office in communicating what we're seeing rising? So we as employees at the shelters can maybe start to better deal with what's possibly coming in. How many of those people are homeless? I guess it's ultimately what it is. Obviously, at the shelters, we deal with addictions. People with addictions, we don't throw them away. But if we don't know what's going on, then we don't even know what to do.
Right, and so, let's take roll the calendar back a few years with the heroin opioid crisis. I've lost track of how many types of events like this that we've done. This is the first one for meth because this is, like I said, it's something that's starting to kind of pop up onto our radar screen, a little bit locally, but certainly more so regionally. That's the reason we're here tonight, to help get that information out. So now, that being said, there are other, call it target populations that could be schools, shelters, our treatment providers. Of course, we learn as much from them as we share with them. So that's what this is all about, information sharing. And recall, when I said, what can you do? Get involved minimally, go when you walk away, help us spread the word, help start getting word out. That's essentially what we're trying to accomplish. So, and I hope that answers your question, but that's and as far as the numbers of addicts that are homeless, that really depends on what your definition of homeless is. There are people that just absolutely have nowhere to go, and they roam the streets, and they stay in the shelters sometimes. But then there's another category of homeless that is more transient. And so I don't have any statistics off the top of my head relative to what numbers are your more, let's call it traditional homeless, where we make arrests for possession, use, or trafficking of some type of illegal drug. But I don't think that number's too terribly high because we don't have that enormous a population of those traditional homeless folks. The transient individuals, we see that a lot of times with individuals that develop some type of a substance addiction. As I explained before, where they start to spiral down and are headed towards rock bottom, what they oftentimes will begin to lose is they lose family contact because they burned bridges there. They lose their jobs, they lose their home, they lose their apartment, whatever the case might be. And now they'll begin getting almost kind of just drifting from place to place to place, So you could technically consider them homeless, and I know that our officers that are assigned to work drug cases, a lot of the individuals that they deal with would fit into that category. But now that's not to say that 18 or 19-year-old that lives in a very affluent neighborhood with an affluent family, that he or she isn't abusing some type of illegal drug as well. So, what specifically those numbers are, I can't tell you. But so I hope that answers or touches the different points of your question. Okay, thanks. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, the relationship between, you're talking about like Ritalin, Adderall, methylphenidate, those drugs are similar in chemical composition and how they affect the brain to methamphetamine. They're not the same drug, but they're similar. And there was a lot of talk in the medical community, in the pediatric medical community for many, many years. ADHD, of course, they would report it was the most overdiagnosed not symptom, but disease or whatever you want to call it. Thank you, disorder, within the pediatric community. I don't know if that's still the case or not, but we've had multiple discussions with the medical community on prescribing practices and how that affects this situation that we're in now. And a small, I don't want to say a minimal, but a small proportion of that was the ADHD medications. I think it's been overshadowed greatly, and I think probably justifiably so based on the opiate prescriptions that have happened. But it's a great point to bring up, that you can't overlook the fact that that is one of the new pathways, the new gateway drug, so to speak, is the prescriptions. And the ADHD medications we found at the drug unit, and again, this would go back 5, 6, 7 years, were a significant category next to the Oxycontins and the Vicodins and Percocets, were a significant category of drug that was being diverted illegally, through doctor shopping and parents selling their kids supply and the same things that happened with it. So that's an excellent point to bring up. Yes, it is a problem.
I don't think it's something that's looking in our community, but I know that those type of facilities do exist. And I think that, most of the time when individuals are currently in our residential programs, they may hold employment. But that doesn't mean if the county is funding for them to stay, they don't necessarily have to pay for their stay there. I think the focus would be that they would be employed and save up money so they can transition back into independent living. But that is something we could take a look at. I think it's a great idea. So. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, any other questions? No? All right. Well, folks, thank you so much for taking the time to come out here tonight. I know it's a busy time of year, but hope you learned a bit that you can take away and help us spread the word, and hope you stay engaged. So thank you.